Welcome to Restore the Glory podcast. My name is Jake Khym.
And I'm Bob Schutz.
We're two Catholic therapists sharing what we've learned personally and professionally to help you on the journey of restoration. If you've been blessed by our podcast, please prayerfully consider partnering with us on Patreon. Your support will help cover the cost to produce the podcast, but will also give you access to exclusive content like monthly reflections and special live stream teachings. Go to patreon.com/restore the glory and join the mission of experiencing the restoration of our God-given glory. So, Bob, good to be back with you once again. We just finished a series on marriage. I guess we did 3 episodes on the unity of marriage and then 3 episodes kind of on healing in marriage, and all that's based on your book, Be Devoted. And we have some really exciting, special something or others coming up today and next episode. But before we get to that, how are you doing? You doing good?
Doing well. Yeah, excited for this.
Yeah, I am too. Okay, I can't wait any longer. What we're doing here is we are crossing a threshold, and we have brought another person onto the podcast, our very first guest on Restore the Glory, and I can't think of a better guest. It's Heather. Heather Khym, my wife, the Heather Khym, is on our show. Bob.
Yay.
So Heather, yay.
Oh, it's such a pleasure to be here with you guys. Thanks for inviting me.
You're welcome. This is fun. Obviously, if people don't know, Heather is my wife, and she also is on the Abiding Together podcast, probably the most popular podcast in the world. So if you haven't heard of that, they've been living under a rock, but you can go check their podcast out. We'll put all that stuff in the show notes. But this is really exciting because we're going to be building off of the series that we talked about in all those previous episodes on marriage. And Heather and I are going to share more of our personal story. Bob, I have to say it's kind of interesting because we're sitting beside each other on a couch and we're looking at you, and I'm thinking,
yeah, this feels like a therapy session.
This is a good therapy.
I was like, we've been here before.
Right, exactly. I know this feeling.
Yeah.
But no, this is really exciting and fun to be able to just share a story. And Bob, I think we were hoping to do this to be able to offer some example and story around all the stuff that we talked about. Any thoughts come to your mind?
Yeah, I just immediately, when we were talking last time about restoring trust, I was thinking about that in both of our lives, and I don't have Margie here to share that, but I can share about it, and you've been sharing about this in your life. But how better than to bring Heather in and to have it be so real and present.
Yeah,
so we're delighted, Heather, for you to be a part of this.
No, I'm so glad to be here, and I love your guys' podcast. I listen to it when I'm driving around, and it's just so fruitful to hear real conversations that are filled with the hope that God truly can heal and restore. And so that's the only reason why we're going to talk about these hard things today. You know, this is not easy normally to get into your wounds and stuff, but for us, it really is a blessing to be able to share what God has done. It's the only reason why we can share about this, because he truly has done an amazing work in our relationship and within our own hearts. So I'm looking forward to sharing about that today.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The offering of your vulnerability to the world is such a gift. And I've heard you each speak about this individually, but I don't know if you've done this together before. So it's an extra level.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that's interesting. Like when we think about our story, now it has such a different feel and tone to it. But boy, we can really empathize with people who are right in the thick of it, because it feels like a long time ago, but it also feels like yesterday in some ways, that we were right in the spaces and places that are so hard. And so I don't know, Bob, maybe Heather and I will give a bit of background to our story, and then we'll get right to the point where our previous episodes we're talking about it. So
yeah, I think that'd be great.
I'll give people have heard my background and overview, my personal story through other podcasts, so they can listen. But I was raised in a Catholic home and had really good-hearted parents. they just had their own wounds. So you can hear a lot about my story with the mother and father episodes that we did, I don't know, a little bit ago. And we joke that the new joke now is that my parents basically smile and say, well, if we hadn't have made so many mistakes, you wouldn't have a career. So you're welcome, which I think is just an hilarious reaction to it all. So that's a whole other thing of just navigating my personal story and all that with my parents, because they've been really exemplars and being humble and being open to that journey. So basically I had an imperfect upbringing, no big shock there. And then the main kind of struggle for me growing up was a sexual struggle that came out of abandonment wounds and then exposure to pornography as a young kid. And so
like 6 years old, young.
Yeah.
Before you could know what was right or wrong really about that.
Yeah, that's true. And so that exposure combined with abandonment wounds put together quite a concoction in my heart that made for quite a recipe that really impacted me. And so then when Heather and I met, the abandonment wounds were very strong still. And falling right at that point, the internet was a new thing. And God bless the people who started off with making the internet what it was, because pornography became something very common in it very soon, unfortunately. So then when we met, that whole struggle was going on behind the scenes. And yeah, I'll pause there.
Yeah. And from my perspective, I grew up in a Catholic family and also imperfect and had a lot of struggles along the way, but I had encountered God in a very powerful way at a young age. And so just when I graduated from high school, I joined a traveling ministry team similar to NET. And I was very involved in the church and very excited about my faith. And I hadn't dated a lot. And so this was all new ground. So from my perspective, I went to Franciscan University to study theology, and I met Jake soon after I got there, who was dating someone else. But yeah, my whole thought was, who's this cute boy from Alabama that I just met? So our worlds were very different interiorly as to how we were coming together and approaching the relationship. I think I was very naive in some ways, but also very trusting. And Jake, didn't obviously come out with all of this right away. And I think that had to do with all the shame and the denial that he was also experiencing. And he was really trying, to go to confession and live the life that he so desperately wanted to, but was just trapped in this cycle of addiction, which I was completely unaware of at that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think then the relationship, so we'd start dating, and we're bypassing all kinds of details, but so then we start dating and get engaged and are married. And the real stuff we want to focus in on is, we're married. And I would say for the first year and a half, 2 years of our marriage, I have this secret double life addiction going on that Heather's not aware of.
I knew that it had been an issue in the past, but Jake had led me to believe that it had been sorted out. And we had I remember having a very vivid conversation before we were married saying, hey, we both have some issues that we're bringing into this relationship. I think it's so important that we dive into that now so that we're not bringing this into a marriage and, potentially affect children and all of that stuff. So those things had been talked about. It's not like we were going in, with rose-colored glasses on. But yeah, he had led me to believe that had already been addressed.
Yeah, and I notice as you're able to look back and reflect on it, you can both do it with a lot of compassion. How about in the middle of it? I hear, Jake, for you, a lot of shame. And for you, Heather, kind of a shock to realize that he wasn't telling me the truth or he was hiding this. And
Yeah, the day that came out, I remember we were in our room and it was just, how the conversation went. And I had asked this question before because there was some suspicions and there was stuff in my heart. It just didn't add up. There was certain things going on in our relationship and in intimacy at times where I felt rejected, but it was the beginning of our relationship. None of it made sense to me. And I just knew in my heart something was off. And so I would occasionally I remember a few times where the conversation kind of came up and I asked, and Jake would act very like shocked that I would even ask, and, upset that I would accuse, that kind of idea. And I think it was just fear for him. He was so afraid that it might come out. So one day we were sitting in our room and it came up again, and I just point blank asked him, how, like, is this what's going on? And you could see on his face at the time, it was like, I mean, he told me later what was going on. It was like, either I choose to come out with it now or I'm going to hide forever. And that's the real blessing of Jake, is that he's always willing to go into the hard place. And it takes a lot of courage, like incredible courage, to do that, especially when you feel so much shame. So he came out with this big confession that this had been going on, and he was very honest, and I was absolutely shattered. Like, I remember my heart felt like it just fell right into my shoes, and the shock and all of that. And, when I look back on that day now, I think that was the worst day of our marriage. And it was also the best day, because everything got real finally. I didn't know that we were living in this facade, that it was a lie. And it was the first opportunity where we were both very vulnerable and very honest.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was a shame that it took that long to get there. But the fact that it finally happened was like, okay, now we have somewhere to go. It's either over or it's going to get increasingly better, from here. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I just remember those first few days of absolute devastation that we both felt. There was tears from both of us. We both didn't really know what to say. And I remember after the first day we had a new baby. Wow. Maria was just like 2 months old. So I remember that first night laying down on the couch with Maria all night, not sleeping, and just crying most of the night. And Jake came walking downstairs with just the weight of shame was just palpable, as he walked down the stairs. And I looked up and I just said, I just want to say, and I was like, my heart was so guarded when I said this, but it was an absolute grace that I could say it. I said, I just want to say that I love you, that this is not the kind of marriage that we're going to have. Mm. And that's all I said. And, I think it was a grace that I preceded that with "I love you." Yeah. I don't even know how that happened. Praise God. But yeah, I think that set the tone for where it was going to go. That things had to change, and it opened wide the door for Jake to dive into healing, which, yeah, he did.
Yeah, we talked last time about the 4 denials, and what I'm hearing right then was for both of you breaking that denial of fact. It's like, we're going to acknowledge the fact of this. Yeah. You first acknowledging what you were experiencing, Heather. And then as you're confronted with that, Jake, you have that choice of, do I hide this or do I bring this out? And as you said, Heather, just the honesty of being able to say it started something new in your relationship. Mm-hmm. But Jake, as I have the opportunity to see you as Heather's talking, and I just feel the pain on your face as you're reliving that. Just, can you share from that place?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's brutal when when you go back and you tell the story, because I am very different now, but I'm not far away from that. And so much has happened in between that time, but it's been like, I can remember the pain. I think that's what I can remember so palpably, is saying that to Heather. And all I remember, I think, is feeling like a ghost of myself, or just feeling so empty. And that feeling of emptiness, it had this domino effect trigger, because I could remember other times in my life feeling that empty. And now I couldn't remember the early childhood times where some of the root abandonment wounds happened, but I imagine it was something similar. But that feeling was the worst. It was the worst. And it's like you can't get rid of it anymore. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what we avoid, right? We don't want that experience because it's so painful. Honestly, Bob, the other thing that was coming to mind was the series we did on Peter, because this is where I know that feeling where he denied the Lord and walked away. And what he went through, I'm like, it's probably pretty similar to what I was going through and Heather was going through.
But what's interesting about what you're saying is that although that moment was excruciating,
Mm-hmm.
you were in excruciating pain before anyway,
That's a good point.
you know?
Yeah. I mean, the denial of the fact of what was happening was huge because I was carrying around the burden of continuing a lie story. And there's no way, you just can't thrive in that environment. And having to lie and having to come up with more lies and having to fake it and all of that. And I mean, here's the reality is that usually your spouse has a pretty decent sense. Now, I feel scared saying that because people hearing that are going to go, "Oh my gosh," right? And I don't want to cause absolute panic in people because it's not 100% true. But Heather knew. She could tell something was off, and I was banking on the fact that I could keep hidden. And that was the worst thing for me, and in hindsight, it was the worst thing. So the pain I feel like I'm also feeling is reliving the story. The pain I'm considering as well is the people who are in that situation right now. My heart so goes out to them. It reminds me of my pain, and especially the ones who were in the position that I was in. That feeling is a horrible feeling and reality. And the thing that's so important is that it doesn't stay there, because that's what you believe, is that it will be like this forever. And that's just not true, but it feels like that's true. I remember going to work, I think we took a day or so off of work, and I remember going back to work. And my boss was Tom McCabe, who's a friend, still a friend. He's Maria's godfather, works in the church, just an amazing guy, great guy. And he was such a blessing to us in that time, because I remember walking back into work. I'm working at a church and I'm doing adult education and stuff and living a completely duplicitous life. And I walk into, and he goes, "Whoa, Jake, what is wrong?" And I was just, I couldn't hardly function. He goes, "Come sit down." And I remember the first words I said to him, "Tom, you need to tell me about annulments. Like, my marriage is over." And he was floored. And he sat and listened to me for probably 2 hours straight. And then he said something to me that it blows me away, because the love of Christ coming through him was something unreal. He said to me that day, so I'm 2 days into this whole thing, he said, "Jake, you need to hold your head high." And I was just floored by, like, how can you say that? And basically he was saying, you're becoming the man that you were designed to be, and you are stepping into reality. And this is not easy.
Wow.
Hold your head high. That phrase to me was like, and when I'm sharing some of this with men, I say, that's when the Rocky music flipped on. It was like, what? I didn't think that was possible, right? And so somebody who I loved and knew loved me and I respected, and he wasn't a pushover kind of guy. He wasn't like a ushy gushy kind of like, "Oh, everything's okay." He wasn't fake. Yeah. So for him to say that, it floored me with hope, really, that what? There's a possibility here?
Yeah. So if I can draw a couple of things out as you're saying that, it's so much here. Heather, you talked about him being in pain before that, but it was the pain of running from the pain and the shame, running from the shame, and you could feel all that. But the sexual compulsion was to medicate the deeper pain of the abandonment. And it was like this just ripped open the wound of that deeper abandonment pain. And in that moment, while Heather's hurting, and I can remember experiences of this in my own marriage, but while Heather's hurting, you can't be there for her because you're so consumed in your own pain in that moment and in your shame. Yeah. And it's really only as you can come up out of your pain and work through your pain that you can see her pain, which is, as we're going along in this process, is part of the journey of healing. But it's like we become so absorbed in our own pain, and it's so deep and it's so basic, and it feels like, well, you're the one that hurt me. Why aren't you helping me right now?
Mhm. Mhm.
And that just adds to more shame because you're just so incapacitated at that point to
Yeah.
be able to get outside of you. It's just a small part of you, small as in
Right.
little part of you that's been
Right.
touched, and a part of you that's didn't receive that kind of nurture and that kind of affirmation at that age, and so there's no
Yeah.
capability at that point
Yeah.
to really love like a husband wants to love and give himself and care for the wound in the heart.
Mhm.
That's so true. Yeah, that's like spot on. That you feel incapable in that moment. It just doubles the shame because it's not like you can't see the pain that you've just caused your spouse, but you feel so incapacitated. And I would say, as I recall the story, I don't sit and ponder this all day long. And so when we are able to share the story, the Lord brings new insights. And one of the things I'm realizing now is the undeniable reality of the grace of God. Like Heather was saying, it was only by grace that she could say, I love you. I forgive you. We're not going to have this marriage. It's only by the grace of God that I didn't just go, all right, I'm just going to go live under a rock for the rest of my life. And I'm done. When people in an athletic situation say that they drew on another spot, they found another gear, they went to another place, and usually that's in a self-reliant context. I can remember feeling absolutely zero capacity, and I was an athlete who prided myself on finding that extra gear, and I knew how to do that, if you will, push yourself to the absolute limit. I had nothing, absolutely nothing. And yet somehow, and this is what I'm realizing right now, God gave me his life to be able to keep stepping forward where I could not on my own. There was no way. I was so debilitated. So that's just amazing right now as I'm recalling that. It's a tangible, real lived experience of the capacity of God coming into my soul as I was honest and open. And God said, I will fill those spaces and give you capacity.
Yeah, and
It's powerful.
I think of about three different avenues of that grace. One, the sacramental grace of all the confessions that you'd gone through to be able to be honest
Yeah.
and acknowledge, and then the ongoing grace of the Eucharist. But then the grace from your sacrament in marriage, Heather's grace, to be able to say that to you, and then also the grace of friendship with Tom, who's able to see you. And so it's like God working through all of those ways inside of you and outside of you.
Amen.
To give you that strength.
Yeah. That was huge. And just to piggyback off of the sacramental grace and the friendship grace, like when Heather said I'd been working on it before, it's very true. I wasn't in a spot where I didn't think it was wrong. Part of my testimony that I talk about is another priest who was a huge blessing to me. His name's Father James Dean, which is just hilarious. And he was at Auburn University when I was there. And Father Dean heard my confession. I can't even imagine how many times that he heard it. Like it would have been over the course of 2 years in the hundreds, like hundreds and hundreds of times he would have heard my confession. And so when you're talking about that, I just want to emphasize, the absolute, God was setting the stage, right? He knew what I needed because not once did Father Dean or any other priest who I ever went to, which is quite amazing because I've heard some stories about people who've had some pretty negative experiences in confession. Not once did anybody ever shame me or get upset at me that I was confessing the same thing. I remember going to Father Dean in confession the same day for the exact same thing and having the ridiculous audacity, you call it courage, it's more audacity, like just crazy. I went to confession on a Saturday morning, and then like at 3 p.m., I'm knocking on his rectory door. And I remember so vividly at times just knocking and feeling I can't stay here. And I just, 2-3 minutes of knocking. And then he came to the door with his stole already on. And he opened the door and we did confession right at the threshold of his rectory. And I never once noticed. Now, maybe he inside was like, buddy, get your, what together. But there was never anything. He would walk, and I just remember him going, in the name of the Father and of the Son.
Here we go again.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so Bob, to your point, that was huge. Those were absolutely huge.
But Jake, I think even what you're saying, it speaks to your humility along the way. Like that takes a lot of humility to keep going back and saying, I was wrong. Like I messed up again, I messed up again. And I think that is fertile soil for healing to occur when we're humble enough to say, I screwed up, or I'm broken here. Like if it isn't something that we're choosing to do, maybe somebody's doing something to us, but to just say like, I'm hurting here. I'm wounded here. I can't do this on my own,
I think the thing I would say to all the people out there who are in that situation right now or not is the worst thing you can do is walk away from the sacraments and the things that you think you don't deserve or you can't. Like that was also the first time I ever encountered Eucharistic adoration. I didn't have any idea what that was, but that was the first time I started praying a rosary and being in Eucharistic adoration once a week with a group of people. That was huge. All those things like you're saying, Tom, I almost said Tom, all the things you're saying, Bob. And the other thing is that was the first time I got into music, where music became a part of my prayer. And I remember just weeping, listening to Rich Mullins, on the CD and just like praying with music for some of the first times ever. It was huge. A lot of the stuff going on right at those times for me in my walk with God.
I want to emphasize a couple of things there. One is all of that was several years before this moment.
That's right.
And it took all of that to be able to get to this moment. And so Heather's experience, which we're going to get into in just a second here, Heather's experience is very different. She doesn't see all that grace operating in the same way because it's all hidden, because this whole area is hidden. I mean, you heard a little bit of it before we got married, Heather, and I imagine respected that in him. But, it's easy for us to look on the outside and say, how could you have all that grace and still lie to your wife this far into marriage? And there's a reasonable comment there, but I think when you get on the inside of somebody's experience, which is what we're trying to do in this, you were trying. You were doing everything you knew how to do.
That's right.
And it just felt like death to you for this to come out with Heather. And so it was a survival more than an intent to deceive her. The effect is deception, but inside of you, it's survival.
It's very true. Yeah, I think that's very accurate.
Yeah. But on the other side, for you, Heather, what was it like for you when in the middle of that, rather than him tending to what you needed and what you were feeling, he was so bound up in his own experience that he couldn't really be there for you?
Yeah, it was very lonely for a number of reasons. Like, one, you don't want to share that kind of situation with just anybody, like he said, we were both working at a church. So there's this feeling of like, a lot of people can't handle that kind of vulnerable pain, and it wouldn't have been appropriate to just share that with just anybody. So we had a couple of key people that we could share with. But for me, it was very lonely. And I think in some ways there was even a blessing in that I only could cling to Jesus in it. I knew that Jesus understood, and I knew that he was really the only place that I could go. So I remember, being, I was part of the worship team at this church, and I would just cry so often, but even like before anybody would come into the church, and I would just be singing like these just gut-wrenching prayers to God through tears and tears and tears. And I remember in one of those times me just saying like, why did you let this happen, God? Like, what, like, this is not, like, I prayed about this, we talked about this, like, this is your promise to me, like, this is it, are you serious? Those kind of questions. And I remember the Lord saying, like, Heather, do you want what you had before Jake told you this? And I said, no, because it wasn't real. And he said, do you want something new? And I said, yes, I do. And he said, the only way for something new is to come through the cross. Are you willing to die here? And it was like, I mean, just through the tears, like the Lord saying that, but also knowing he died there. Like he's not saying this to me from an absent, like outside perspective. He's inviting me into a death that leads to resurrection, not just a death. And I think that's what it feels like when we're in the midst of that, is just like, this just feels like death, and it is, but on the other side of death is a resurrection when we're going there with the Lord. And so that really propelled me into, no matter what was coming at me, the lack of support or Jake not being able to be there. And in some ways I didn't want him to be there. Like I was shutting down so quickly. I was just like, I couldn't even imagine holding his hand at that point. Like I just didn't want anything from him because all I could feel from him was pain.
Yeah.
That was really my journey of healing, was to get to stay open. And the shutdown happens fast for me when I'm hurt. And so that seemed impossible in my mind. That was the miracle that I needed God to work in my own heart, was to open me back up again, to trust. Yeah, to trust. Because trust seemed like, if people, I'm pretty good with a lot of things, and I generally don't struggle with resentment or carrying stuff like that. But if someone lies to me and betrays me, that's very hard for me. I could say I forgive you. I just don't know how to trust you again. And I think that's where I was at with Jake, was in all of my struggling and prayers with the Lord. I was like, I can see, God, that you might be able to heal Jake. And I know that you have the power to do that. I just don't know how we're ever going to have a vulnerable marriage again where we both trust. That's what I couldn't see at that point.
Yeah. How did that progress for you? How did that prayer get answered?
Yeah, I think it was a few ways. One, it took actual decisions on my part to act open, even though my feelings weren't there yet. And so that didn't mean, hey, Jake, come, let's, have sex, or let's, act like, or speak something with our bodies that isn't true. It wasn't that. It was in the little things of like, will I sit next to him on the couch? Like that was how hard it was. Like I just needed to practice openness, even though I didn't have the feelings that accompanied it at that point. Yeah, there was many things along the way where, as Jake was healing, that I was not just standing there watching him try to do the work to regain what was lost, but I too was willing to keep going into my heart. Where is my resistance? Where is my despair creeping in? Where am I being cold or, not open to what God is doing here? And so I think both of us were working on things, even though we weren't necessarily doing the exact same work together, That was part of the process. And I think too, a big part of it was Jake wasn't trustworthy. That was the truth. When we talk about denial of the facts and things, the fact was Jake had an addiction and he wasn't trustworthy. It would have been inappropriate for me to trust him at the beginning. But as he did the hard work and as he grew in character and integrity, he became more trustworthy along the way. And so he's restoring trust by being the man that he truly was underneath all of that. Because I remember it was either Tom or Christopher West that said early on to me when I was questioning, who is this guy that I'm married to? I'm questioning everything because there's so many lies. And he just said, Jake is not his sin. He is not his sin. And that was the identity thing of that is, and I knew that right when he said it. I was like, that is the truth right there. This isn't who Jake is. And I actually know who Jake is underneath all of this. And that's who I want to pursue. And that's who I want to stay open to.
Yeah, that's powerful.
So as Jake rebuilt all the stuff, then I was able to trust because he was becoming trustworthy.
Yeah, that's good. You're honest with yourself in the places where his character wasn't in a place where you could trust, but you could still see the person that he is beyond the sin. And believe in that person, even when he's not yet living into it. So seeing somebody, we've talked about it before, seeing somebody in their wholeness rather than defining them by their brokenness. But at the same time, your heart is still in this very protected place.
Yeah.
And needing your own healing. And so as you're describing a parallel path, why you couldn't be that for each other then, other than the things that you're describing, you could each pursue that. At what point did you become aware that this was tapping into other places in your heart, or was it tapping into other places.
We went to a counselor very early on who wanted to go there too fast for me. And he wasn't kind. He wasn't sensitive. And he was like, yeah, we really need to look at, Heather, what role you played in this addiction.
Mhm.
And I was just like, just rage started to like build up in my heart. I was like, this is not my fault. Like, and it wasn't.
Right.
That is not my fault,
Mm-hmm.
but I did have to, over time, begin to look at what was happening within my own heart and what it was triggering, because yes, this was painful, but there was more pain that was coming up, rejection, the lack of trust, just male figures in my life who had failed along the way and not been there for me or not been who I needed them to be. Wounds from, father and brother and other guys in my life that had just, failed in the relationship in various ways, although good guys, but there was just deep wounds there that I realized not all of this belongs to Jake and this situation that we're dealing with here. So over time, and I'm talking time as in years, it was a slow unraveling of me being able to deconstruct some of those places in my own life where there was pain, other pain underneath. And as those have been coming up and I've been restoring, I think that definitely is impacting our marriage, in a good way.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. And I just hear the emphasis on the years. And, for some that can become discouraging. Well, this is going to take years. But it's not just the years of repairing this, but it's the years of our hearts being restored in Christ, which is part of the gift of an experience. And I don't want to say that glibly, that, living in this kind of addiction and being wounded by it is not a gift, but the gift is the work of God in and through those things that gets us deeper into our hearts. And that's what I hear for both of you, is you both turn towards God rather than towards yourself.
Yeah.
Or against the other.
Or the other. And it wasn't perfect.
Right.
But you both have been willing to do the work, and it's a process. And so trust is a process of being restored. Character is a process of being restored. Hope is a process of being restored. So I'd like to hear from each of you those, in terms of those 4 denials, when, we've already talked about the denial of fact. And so that was in that moment when it was brought out. How about the denial of responsibility? Was that immediate also? Did you?
Yeah, I would say for me, what do we have to do to restore this was pretty, that one I don't feel like was something that we denied. Once the facts were in the open, it was pretty clear. This isn't a proper way for a husband to conduct himself in a marriage, period. And so I knew that my own personal restoration, as well as the restoration of what I had damaged in Heather and in our marriage, was a lot of that. I guess you'd say it's I'm owning it, but it's not, I have to lift it all on my own, because that's self-reliance just wants to creep in here and take over, just ultimately to defeat you.
False responsibilities, like I've got to fix this myself.
Exactly. And that's impossible to try to fix it by yourself. And that's not at all what was going on. But I was open to the process, and I knew that it was, my responsibility. I think what happened throughout that, where responsibility wasn't being accepted, and it was more subtle denials with responsibility, because the temptation when you're, it's an intense first month, and then it slowly starts to shift. And, when you get 6 months, 8 months into it, you're kind of back into a normal rhythm again. And it's in those spaces and places where the denial of responsibility can be, because one of the things that we learned is the need to not be afraid to talk about it, no matter when. And so, or Heather having a bad day, remembering it, and me going, gosh, we're past this. That's, to me, there's the denial right there of, hey, that's okay for her to still be hurt by this. And I'm the one who instigated all of that pain.
Yeah, it sounds like that goes into the third denial, which is denial of consequences, which is, I want you to be over this. I want you to be not having this pain, rather than these are some of the inevitable consequences of what we've walked through, and you have a right to have this pain, and I'm not going to force you to get over it or do it, but I'm just going to acknowledge it's hard for me to hear it, and I acknowledge that this is part of the consequences.
Yeah, and strangely, I guess it's not strange, but in my discussions with many women who have had to, painfully go through the same thing, they feel the pressure, especially sexually, to deny that there are consequences to this. I think there's a fear that their husband will go somewhere else or find, satisfaction somewhere else. And so they feel the pressure to open that door again in the relationship when they're not even ready to do that yet. And I think that that's something that couples really need to talk about, in all honesty. Because like I said earlier, it's hard to say something with your body that you don't mean in your heart. It feels like a lie on some level.
Yeah.
And it's not that you use that, to hold it over the other person as a punishment. That's a whole other thing, but to just be honest about what's appropriate at what stage in the relationship and the repair.
Mm-hmm. My experience has been when a wife in the situation forces herself to give her body and her heart gets more distant, it really creates a whole nother issue of feeling used, feeling disinterested in the sexual relationship, feeling less trust, having more judgment. So it's really, as difficult and as frightening it is really important to not deny the consequences inside your own heart and how that's playing out on both sides, and to continue to process that with Jesus.
I mean, I would say that maybe I'm stretching the analogy a bit here, but that almost goes back to where the person who was hurt can begin to deny the facts, responsibility, and consequences because they might feel pressure from the other to get over it quicker. And, usually you'd think, oh, it's the person who hurt is the one who's going to be doing the denying. We've experienced it, professionally, Bob, I know we have, and Heather and I see it in multiple settings where the one who has been hurt wants to start denying it to just get it over quicker. And that does not, work. And I think one of the things
we had to start dating again in some ways as part of the repair. Like Jake needed to take me out for dinner and we needed to have restorative conversations and joyful moments together. And all of those things were part of the rebuilding.
And we stopped, to be blunt, we stopped all physical intimacy for a period of time because there needed to be self-mastery on my part. And right there is the place where people get bothered. That's where I've experienced that people get irritated because they go, well, why can't I just go? And that's when the young, immature places come out because they don't want to do the actual journey of restoration.
And that
they want Band-Aids.
Yeah, that partly was the restoration of trust for me, was to know that Jake was not taking all of these things elsewhere, that he was really going to Jesus with all of this, and that he was learning, the self-mastery that was needed for a good marriage. Like it was needed before, but it was definitely needed, going forward. So
and I'd say right there is where, if you want to get real in your relationship with God, that's a really good place to get really real with him, because so many people, we talk about walking with God, but when you walk with God through these kind of situations, the relationship makes it very real. It's very tangible because the immature places are coming right out. And if I, the one who had the immature places coming out, is willing to not deny them, I am on a path to real restoration. And I'm not the kind of guy who likes a cheap win. I want a real win. And so the thought of just shortcutting the process and finding loopholes, and I'm just that just is not the kind of man I want to be. I don't want to stand on a facade again. That's the whole thing I was getting away from,
That takes character in itself. As you're both speaking, I'm thinking of so many couples, and there's those couples who have kind of a fundamental understanding of Scripture, and will quote in the middle of something like that, covering up the sexual compulsion, that a woman and man don't belong to themselves; they owe it to each other. From
the
from
marital debt.
yeah. And yet, if you keep reading that Scripture, say, except for a time of mutual agreement where they abstain. And I've had so many couples where I've introduced to that, and there's always so much anger and frustration in that. But, if you're an alcoholic, you need to be free from drinking.
Yeah.
And, with a sexual compulsion, you can't be free for the rest of your life if you're married from sexual activity, but you can be free for a period of time from the compulsion for sex, whether it's in pornography, masturbation, or infidelity, or even in marital sex. And that's what John Paul II says is, it becomes lust if the spouse isn't fully willing and entering in from their heart. And every husband and wife can know that intuitively, whether their spouse is really wholeheartedly entering into the marital embrace. And that's the true understanding of the Scripture. The Scripture isn't, well, you owe this to her, or you owe this to him. You owe love, owe no man anything but to love one another. And when love is present, then the sexual intimacy can be restored. When love isn't present, then it's just using and lust.
Yeah. That's, I think, a really, Christopher West, who is a friend of all of ours and just so happened to be a parishioner at the parish I worked at and became a guy who started to accompany us along with Tom. He used to say, sex is the thing that'll expose everything, right? You want to see the health of relationship? Let's start with the sexual relationship because it will shine a light on the health of everything else that's underneath it, because it's a culmination expression. And I think what happens there, and I'll speak for myself, sex was an idol that I went to make myself feel better instead of trusting and going to the Lord. And so just like any immature boy or girl or any addict or whatever, when you start to take the thing out of their hands that they believe is the answer, you're going to see tantrums coming out. And that's what I think really goes on, is it exposes the distrust that God can actually satisfy my heart. This is where the narrow way you really feel the narrow way. Do I trust that God will satisfy me? Because what happens is you go to prayer and you're like, nothing's happening. Nothing's happening. This is useless. Nothing's happening, without realizing that all those thoughts are very important and influencing. And then 2, whoever said that feelings were the ultimate answer to every solution and problem? Number 3, this was a big one for me, is I started to realize, what if God is working on a level of my heart that I can't sense or feel? And I went, theologically, I can't argue against that. He's God. He has the capacity to be doing things deeper than I can detect. And the reality was, it was true. The more I was just faithful to 15 minutes of prayer every day and doing the things I committed to grow in self-mastery, I couldn't look back in the day and see an effect. But when I measured in the month, in the quarter, and the half year, and the year, I couldn't deny that things were changing. But on the day-to-day, I couldn't tell you what actually occurred.
Yeah.
And there was a real maturation process, was learning how to trust and not go to idols. And there, to me, I'm like, that's the heart of the gospel. That's the invitation out of the old man into the new man. That's where it's hard.
That's where both of you are saying that entering into the suffering for the purpose of resurrection is, it's not a good feeling. It's not, in those moments, there's not a lot of consolation. I mean, God gives consolation to each of you in it, but there's not a lot of consolation in the experience. It's a dying. So how about if we bring it to the restoration of hope, or the denial of hope? How can you both speak to that in your marriage? Heather, you want to start there?
Yeah, sure. With this situation, what's coming to mind, like this particular moment in our marriage, I feel like, again, there was a grace of hope that was planted in my heart, really from the Lord. I really do believe that, because I remember talking to a dear friend who's a priest about this situation and just saying how heartbroken I was. And I remember him saying, he literally said, Heather, don't get your hopes up. This will likely be, a part of Jake's story forever. And I just about lost my mind. Like in the phone call, I remember just this, like, it was the truth that was like burning in my heart. And I just said to him, because he's a dear friend, I just said, don't say that to me. And I said, I don't believe that that's true. I said, if God can't redeem and restore all things, then what are we doing? Like, what is this all about? And I said, I just do not believe that. Like, God can restore this. And he was just like dead silent on the other end of the phone. And I remember even later him going through his own healing process and hope being restored. He was experiencing his own denial of hope, which he was speaking into my life. And it's like the Lord just was like, no, like a big shield of no, this will not come into your world because it's not the truth. And I remember God saying to me, like, pay attention, Heather. This is bigger than you. Like, what I'm doing here is bigger than you. And that was very true, because what he was teaching us along the way was like that he really can heal and restore. He really is who he says he is. And I don't think I knew that on like the depth of the level that I do now. Mm-hmm. And I had seen evidence of him coming through. Like my dad had a miraculous healing of cancer when I was a senior in high school. So I knew that God was real and that he was powerful. It was just like, can he be real and powerful here for me now? And then on the alternate part, we had another friend come in who was a seminarian who's now a priest, and he had just gone through this whole restoration therapy thing, and he came to visit us, and I took one look at him because I'd known him for years. This is our good friend Father Justin Brady, and I took one look at him and I said, what happened to you? And he hadn't told me anything, and he said, I have a lot to share with you guys. And he just like broke open this whole story of restoration and healing and redemption in his own life, which was like a huge beacon of hope for Jake and I at that point. Like Jake immediately was like, how can I go there? And that's one gift of Jake is like, he was willing to do everything that he could to experience restoration. Yes, he was going to Jesus, but he was also going to counseling, and he was also fasting, and he was also like, going to these healing retreats. And we need people. I guess that's what I want to say is like the community that we did have, although I said, yeah, you can't share this with everybody, but we did have certain people that were holding hope for us, even when we didn't know how to do that, or we didn't have it ourselves. They were believing for us in those moments that God really could redeem and restore this relationship. And he did. That's the beautiful part. That's the only reason I said this at the beginning, why we can share this is because God did. Like, this isn't an issue for Jake anymore. In fact, that was the last time that he ever struggled with pornography was, when he confessed that. And like, that is a miracle of miracles that occurred.
Yeah.
But I share that because it's possible, it is possible through Jesus.
And as you're speaking, look at all the fruit of you guys beginning a ministry of life restoration. Father Justin and what he's doing. He's my spiritual director, and too. Sisters, and yours too. And look at all the manifest fruit from that restoration. It's just beautiful.
Yep. That's huge. That's why I became a therapist, was going to that therapeutic retreat with Father Justin. The next round he and I did together, and it was a group therapy. That's when the seed was planted for me to do therapy. That's where I learned about inner healing prayer. Almost everything that I do now in my work with people came out of this season. Some of it was before that, but so much of it came out of this season. And I'll say for me that the Father loved me so well, but I couldn't see it at the time because he knew my heart and he knew how to inspire me to keep walking the walk. And so I love sharing this story because I get to tease Christopher West a little bit because he was an absolute godsend to me in particular, but to us as well, because Christopher is not he's not a weak, wimpy guy. He's a passionate guy. And he held on to the hope of Christ's redemption for us for a long time. I remember meeting with him in the mornings. We would meet, once a week or almost every other week, quite regularly, going to breakfast at 7 somewhere, going to a coffee shop or whatever. And I remember saying so many times, Christopher, I can't do this. There's no way. This is impossible. I can't do this. And he would just say, no, you can. The cross of Christ you can. And there was one time in particular that it was so embarrassing, but so awesome at the same time. We were in Panera Bread, and I love this because Christopher doesn't remember it. And I'm going, how can you not remember this? So we're in Panera Bread, and I remember the coffee shop vividly. So we're sitting there and we're having I didn't even drink coffee at the time, but, and I'm like, Christopher, I can't do this. Like, I mean, masturbation is like, I can't stop it. And something in him snapped. And he, in the middle of the coffee shop, one of those little 2-person tables, he slammed his fist on the table and he goes, you will not let the sin of masturbation defeat you. And he's slamming his fist on the table. The fork, shouting this, and the fork flies off the table and the entire restaurant goes, and they all look over here, and I'm like going, shut up. It's like he lost himself in a moment, but he was unwilling to let any foothold of a lie get in. He was so passionately committed to the power of the cross that he was literally smashing the table. And I loved that from him. It was so embarrassing. And I was like, we're out of here. Like, get me out of here. You're
Thank
crazy.
Thank goodness social media didn't exist.
Yeah, really.
Recording that moment.
That would have been like classic. But I'll never forget it because he held on to hope for me there. Yeah. All I was coming with was this is impossible. Yeah. And his passion for it was so good for my heart. And I drank his passion in. And that helped me.
And again, you could believe it because he had experienced it in his own life.
Right.
And he knew it to be true.
Yeah.
And which is the power of both of your witness. I mean, there's something you know to be true that people can't deny, a witness that you've lived.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, we were saying just the other day, we were talking about something and I said, it just struck me. One of the things that we were just talking about the other day was that it was in 2000, when all of that stopped was in 2003. And so it struck me the other day that we're in 2021 now, that, I mean, that's a lot of years
of freedom
that now I take for granted. But when we tell the story again, I don't take it for granted because I'm in new seasons and places now. I'm in deeper working out of character and restoration. There's still areas to work on in restoration. And so one of the things I think that it's amazing that it happened, but at the same time, I'm not afraid of the journey anymore. I welcome the journey. Now, it doesn't mean I go, yay, let's go and it'll be awful. Yay. That's not it at all. That's a bit immature and ridiculous, but it's worth it.
Well, and we're not alone in the journey. I think that that's what people are so afraid of is like, what if I go there, into these areas of brokenness and wounds in my life, like, am I just going to find more brokenness and wounds? And I think what we found is, no, Jesus was right there. Like he was there and we're not alone. And it's in the journey that we both grew an incredible intimacy and love with Jesus, like individually, but also as a couple. And I think that that's part of the journey that I can never regret going through that because I would not have the relationship that I do with the Lord if I hadn't gone through that, and it's not that he made that happen so that we'd be closer to him. It's that he uses all things for good for those who love him. And the intimacy that we now have with him has, I think carries us through many more storms that we've had to endure in our marriage too.
Mm-hmm. One question that occurs to me before we bring this to closure is, when and how did you begin to attend to each other's pain in this, moving out from my own healing into, I really see and have compassion and feel the hurt that you've experienced and vice versa?
I think for me, it was in Jake understanding his own story from the beginning, and being able to tell me that story and for me to understand his story. And I think that that is key for couples like you, to be able to share your story in its entirety. And for him to do that, he had to understand his own story, which there was so much denial there about certain pieces that it just took time. That was part of the fruit of the journey as well. So me hearing his story, understanding where the pain came from, what it would have been like for a little boy at 6 years old to see the things that he saw that he never should have seen, and what that planted in his heart, it gave me compassion for him, so I was able to see beyond my own hurt and love him in the places where he was hurt, where it all originated. It originated with a wound. This isn't who he was. Like I said, he's not a sin. So who was he before all of this began? And I think that was really, really key for me. What would you say?
Yeah, I would say the dynamic for me was it had to do with the denial of consequences, to go back to that. Like, I really was attending to Heather's pain. And I would say this was probably the longest part of the journey, and appropriately so, that the apology process, the restoration process of my character, that was the longest thing. And one of the things that we said to each other is, it's okay for me to apologize. I didn't say this to Heather. It was more something I learned and she taught me, was for a year later, 2 years later, because the realities are still there. And so one of the things that I would notice when I would attend to Heather's pain is what do I need to do to put her at ease, that I am somebody who's worthy of trust, so that she can know she's safe with me and doesn't have to guard herself. So being a person who I do what I say was attending to her need to know that I'm trustworthy. And so I was starting to, the shift from I'm doing this because I want to be free to I'm doing this because I want her to have a space where she can be safe and free and comfortable and not have to worry. And so interestingly, it still had to do with the development of my character, but it was the development of my character for her sake, as opposed to for my sake and just for me. And I would say that's been an ongoing dynamic. I'm still growing and maturing a lot in the areas of doing things for Heather's sake. When Heather talked about the future storms and whatever, I'd say, those are the new areas and new places that came up for us, is a greater attentiveness to respect of each other's ways of life, and honoring that with each other, and loving each other in it, and not forcing the other one to do life our way.
When you and I teach, Jake, we talk about the stages and development of self-mastery first, which is what you talked about, and then self-giving. And you can't have self-giving without self-mastery. So that's a long reparation process. But what I hear is that growing edge through this was learning how to move first in self-mastery and then in self-giving, which is not just needing her to have compassion for your pain or needing her to give you what you needed, but you being able to resist the compulsion to get what you needed from her.
Yes.
And the strength of character to be able to look at her and say, oh man, I really hurt you, and you hurt even before I met you, and I care about all those places, and even now there are places where I'm hurting you.
Yes.
And I want to love you there. I want to feel your pain there.
Yes.
And love you there, and give you space and freedom.
Yes.
To manage your own life, not be controlled by my actions or reactions.
I think probably one of the biggest ones that's coming to mind again as we sit with it right now is the young parts. That's been a really helpful thing for both of us. Heather attuning to the young part of me that experienced those things, and me attuning to the young part of Heather that experienced the pain. There's for us like a really powerful space to stay focused in on. What's the young part of Heather going through and feeling? What's the teenage part of Heather? And that's just an analogy, right? To understand, wow, when she was young, these things were happening. And oh my gosh, no wonder she would be really concerned about safety. So I'm going to ... because there's this young part of her, and so now I become part of her journey of restoration and healing because I'm attentive to her story and those quote unquote parts of her.
Yeah. So often we tend to mock each other's immaturity. Oh, you're so immature in that place, rather than embrace that place that hasn't yet matured.
Right.
Yeah, I think, part of that is just the vision of what marriage is and what Jesus calls for us in marriage. Like it's bigger than us. And there's something about that that's really important for me. It's like, if I truly want to live marriage in the way that it was meant to be lived, then there's certain things that need to happen, like openness and care and concern, compassion, sensitivity, like all of these different things. And I'm like, if I'm shutting down, if I'm continuing to reserve and hold back, like this is not the life that God called me to. And there's a quote by John Paul II that it's really become a life quote for me. And it was at one of the World Youth Days where he talked about, like, don't allow yourself to be ground down by mediocrity. And that has just, like, it is so deeply embedded within my heart that Jesus came that we would have life and have it to the full. And I'm like, Lord, I want the full life. Like, I don't want mediocre. And sometimes there's pain in that. And sometimes I'm like, I wish I could just be content with mediocre, but I can't. Like, there's just something in me that is like longing for the more. And I think we all have that, and we cover it up with, I don't want to have hope there. Or maybe it won't happen for me, but this is the life that Jesus has called us to. And so when I'm engaged with the truth, which that is a part of my work, is like, I need to be regularly engaging with the truth about what God says about marriage, not what I feel, about what God's call is, God's hope is. Like, I want to align with that instead of with what I might be feeling or getting distracted by, or what the enemy is trying to do here. And that's how I've been able to stay open, is by just, Jake has been talking about this, the long journey. And I'm sure people are like, oh gosh, like this just sounds heavy. Really it is steps of doing the next right thing. It's like, in this moment, what's the next right thing that I can do? The next holy thing that I can do, the next gift of self that I can make here in this moment, in the little ways and in the big ways. So,
yeah, I think, when I reference the journey, this would kind of be my final thought, that this is Christianity. I mean, that's basically what we're trying to say here, is that we engaged in a sacrament, and the church in her wisdom knows that sacraments are meant to make their recipients holy and restore what's broken and bring them back to who God designed them to be. This is the sacrament of marriage.
It's forever on this earth, It is. And there's something powerful about that. And there's something that we need. We need it to be long. And a lot of people want to bail out early. And I think with our story, and this is not just what this has been over and over again, you never know when restoration and breakthrough is right around the corner. And there's so many times that I have felt like I should bail and get out of here. Like, the fight, flight, freeze. I'm the flight, like, get me out of here, like when something gets too hard. And I think if I had responded to that, I would have missed out on the next stage of goodness and greatness,
Yeah.
So the journey that you engage in is Christianity, and that's what makes you holy. And so, I said it before in another episode, marriage is a saint maker. And if my goal is to be constantly experiencing pleasure, that's not what this is. It's about the restoration of the depth and glory of God within me as he designed me and Heather and each and every person. And it's good and it's worth it. It's not what the culture promotes as quick fixes. Like, it's a stupid joke, but God did not invent microwaves, because he just doesn't do stuff that fast where you push buttons, put it in, 30 seconds later, it's all ready. That's just not his style. That's not his approach. That's us trying to bypass the journey of things. And there's no microwave in Christianity, like, it is a relational, ongoing journey of becoming who we were designed to be. And it's worth it, and it's not that it's always bad. We're sharing like some of the more difficult times. It's not that it's always bad. Like, we're still very much on the journey in our marriage, right? Like, I would say we've gone through, we're, kind of in the 3/4 part of another very deep season of healing. It's not like all that stuff happened and now we talk about it and that's our testimony and we're all good now. No, actually not the case. We've been going through another very intense section in the past 3 or 4 years. That's another very deep excavation of our own hearts and journey. And so because of the first one, the second one, it's really worth it. Like we have a lot of like, this is worth it. And it's borne a ton of fruit already. Now we've got a lot of areas to go, and then who knows when the next season will be, but it's for good. It's really for good.
I can comment seeing the fruit in each of your lives and how that gets poured out to so many others. And then also your children. I haven't met your children, but everything that I know about them, they've grown up to be really solid kids. And I contrast that with my dad's infidelity, my parents breaking up and growing up as a child without a dad for several years. And, even though there was a healing process, there was a lot that we lost as a family because my parents didn't do that work at that point together. And so just a lot of admiration for your choices at that point and the grace that you had to choose to press in and continuing to choose to press in. And just who knows how much fruit and grace is going to pour out just from this conversation to so many people. I can think of many that I want to share this with that are in this struggle. So just appreciate you both and your vulnerability and sharing that.
Yeah. Thanks, Bob, for being an awesome facilitator of the conversation. That's great.
Yeah. And thanks for having me as your first guest. I feel like I'm going to hang that on my wall. First guest of Restore the Glory podcast.
That'd be
I'll
awesome.
put that on my resume.
Yeah.
No, it was a pleasure to be with you both. And I too, I'm so grateful that what you're responding to this call to just take the time to share the wisdom and the experiences with other people. And I think it really is like just embedding hope in people that they too can experience, restoration of the glory that God intended for them.
Well, listeners, thanks for being with us. We'll stop there. Our typical spiel, but thanks for being with us, and we look forward to talking to you again soon.